As much as I love the PS5, one of the things that Sony did with it that I'm not a huge fan of was how they handled supporting past accessories from the PS4. Mainly that you can't really use any Pro controllers. You can if you're playing PS4 titles, but as soon as you play something that is a PS5 title, you have to use a PS5 specific controller. This basically hit the reset button for Pro controllers on the PS5, and today I'm taking a look at what is basically the first big name one to get released for the system, the Scuf Reflex. Full disclosure, this is not a sponsored video, but Scuf did send me these controllers to test out and try out for review purposes, and man do I have a lot of thoughts about them. First off, one thing I want to touch on real quick is you might notice that this looks a lot like an official DualSense controller with some light changes, and that's because it basically is. While Scuf has messed with from-the-ground-up controller designs in the past, most of their Pro controllers are really just heavily modified official Pro controllers. And one of the big benefits of this is the fact that as far as compatibility is concerned, this is a DualSense. Anything you could use your DualSense controller for, whether that's using it with a mobile phone, using it on your PS5, using it on a PC, using a dedicated wired connection with that setting turned on in your PS5, all of that stuff the Scuf Reflex is going to do as well, because for all intents and purposes, it is a DualSense. Of course, it's one that has been heavily modified, though, to offer a lot of different Pro controller features. Now, one thing that is a little different from a lot of Scuf's past releases is that this current controller does not have a full customization option. A lot of Scuf controllers, you have the ability to pick and choose specific settings, a look and design, and then order it. For the Reflex right now, there's really just 3 different pre-built configurations you can purchase. There's the regular Scuf Reflex, the Scuf Reflex Pro, which is the one I'm holding right now, and there is also the Scuf Reflex FPS. What differentiates these models aside from price point is the full feature list included in each one. The Reflex Pro is kind of the mid-ranged all-arounder option. It features a redesigned grip, 4 remappable back paddles on the back of the controller, the ability to swap between 3 different button profiles, swappable stick heads, which are a newer design that Scuf has been using for the current generation systems, and just an overall redone look. The regular Reflex offers most of these options. Really the only big thing you lose out on is the redesigned grip, and it does have fewer color options available. And the FPS is a slightly heavier redesign. Basically, this gets rid of some of the special features that make a DualSense, but in exchange, heavily specializes the controller for FPS uses. Specifically, you lose out on the haptics because they've removed the motors to make it an overall much lighter controller, and they have replaced the DualSense's adaptive triggers with Scuf's more recently designed instant triggers. So instead of being an analog pull, it's just an immediate button click. This makes the FPS design in particular heavily focused just for FPS games. With some of these feature changes, you just straight up can't use it for certain titles like, say, Gran Turismo, where you need a full analog pull for the trigger. Obviously, if you need access to the more traditional things like adaptive triggers and haptics for certain games, you can use the regular DualSense that comes with your system. The goal of the FPS model is to be specifically for FPS games. Now, me personally, I don't play a ton of FPS, and so the majority of my time was really spent with the Reflex Pro. And my general reaction to it has been that it is a solid first Pro controller option for the PS5 that just leaves a little bit to be desired in a couple key areas that we'll talk about. First off, the stick heads. These are the same stick designs they used on their Instinct controller, which is their newest Xbox Pro controller, and it's absolutely one of my favorite things that they've done with their Pro controller designs. It has similar options to what we've seen on past Pro controllers with swappable stick heads, where you have the shorter sticks, the longer sticks, concave versus convex heads, but one of the big design shifts that I really appreciate is that they have this very pronounced edge around the top of the stick that also has a texture to it. This allows you to basically use the stick head in one of 2 major popular ways, either keeping your thumb on the top of the stick, focused on the stick head itself, or instead keeping your thumb on the edge of the stick, something that I find that I do a lot with the right stick head in particular when it's being used for camera controls, and I really like this design. The redesigned grip is also excellent, it's comfortable, it holds up really well against sweat, and in general, while they have obviously had to redesign the controller a little bit to get rid of some of the PlayStation branding, I really like the look they've taken for the Reflex. I think it's a really clean, nice design. Some past Scuf controllers have been very loud, and you still have that option with some of their customizable ones, but as far as just the base design goes, really love this look. Where I'm a little more mixed on the controller is the back paddles, and a lot of this has to do with how it holds up and compares to one of their own other designs with the Scuf Instinct for Xbox. Now, some of this comes down to personal preference, but I really do think that the back buttons on the Instinct are just better than the Reflex. First off, in terms of the personal preference aspect, if you look at the Instinct back buttons, the inner ones are curved and pronounced a lot more out, and what that allows you to do is you can hit the outer buttons with a traditional press, and when you want to hit the inner button, you just kind of curve your finger in a little bit to tap it, and you're good to go. The Reflex doesn't work this way. Instead, when you want to use one of the inner paddles, you have to press down directly on it like a regular back button, which still works and is a fully functional thing, but I've just gotten so used to the way the Instinct works that I find I like that design a lot more. Now, on a slightly more objective tangent, when you have both these controllers side by side, using the back paddles in each one, you'll note that the Instincts are just a lot more crisp. There's a much more very defined button click feeling that is really satisfying. You still have a clicky register on the Reflex, it just isn't quite as pronounced. Now, one upside of the Reflex over the Instinct, though, that I think is worth pointing out is that the back paddles on this are removable. So if you find yourself not liking to use certain buttons, like in the case of me not liking the inner ones as much, you can just remove them. The mechanism for which is a little weird. You basically just grab the paddle and pull down to rip it out. And it's one of those mechanisms where, yes, it's designed to work this way, but it almost kind of feels like you're breaking it in the process, and you're not. It's just very awkward to do the first time. It does get a little easier to do over time, and with this controller, I have found myself really just removing these inner paddles and leaving the outer ones for use. Like with the Instinct, you do have the ability to load 3 different profiles on this controller for mapping what these 4 back buttons do. There are 3 pre-designed profiles right away that you have access to, but you can customize them freely as you wish by making use of this little button back here. There's also one other admittedly very nitpicky little thing I want to point out real quick. I also just don't really care for the home button replacement on the Reflex. They got rid of the PlayStation button, again for certain obvious reasons because branding and logo, but the official home button on the DualSense just had this very nice crisp press to it. It's a little upraised. It's more sunken in on the Reflex, and the button just doesn't feel as good to use. Of all the buttons to care about from a competitive standpoint, the home button is not one that even really registers. It's not important, it's just to go back to the home menu. But still, I like the official option more, so I just wanted to shout that out. Overall, I like the Reflex a lot. You know, as far as being one of the first kind of big name Pro Controller options for the PS5 goes, I think it's a really strong choice. Really, my biggest hangups with it is that I like the Instinct more for a couple of different reasons, which if at the end of the day, your goal is to get a Pro Controller for your PS5, that doesn't matter, because you want a Pro Controller for the PS5. But if, say, you're looking for a Pro Controller to use on PC and that opens up your options a little more, I actually think the Instinct is a better way to go. It's a more affordably priced controller in comparison. You have the ability to swap between an instant click or doing a more traditional analog control, whereas on the Reflex, you have to buy a model dedicated to one option or the other. And again, I like the back paddles on the Instinct more. But if you want a PS5 controller that's not only going to support those official features like adaptive triggers and haptics, while also having pro features on top of that, like back buttons and swappable sticks, then the Reflex is the way to go right now. Now, with Scuf Pro controllers, there is one other thing we need to touch on though, and that's price. Pro controllers in general are not cheap. They're generally quite a bit more than official options, oftentimes being easily over twice as much, and Scuf especially goes on the high end, with the Reflex starting at $200, with the Reflex Pro and Reflex FPS costing even more. And while I do like these controllers a lot, they're definitely crossing a line where, yes, they're great, but I'm just not quite sure if you're getting the full value for how much money you're throwing down all at once. The thing is, like I said at the top of this video, this is basically the one big name Pro Controller option available for the PS5, though that could change in the near future. I think if you're in need of a Pro Controller option for the PS5 as soon as possible, this is an excellent choice that will get the job done. It's just going to cost you for throwing down on right now. But if you're not in a hurry, it might be worth just waiting a little while longer and seeing if any other options end up coming into the market that might give you a little bit more of a competitive price point to choose from. If you don't want to wait though, the Reflex is a really good option. It's just going to cost you. So those are my thoughts on Scuf's line of Reflex Pro controllers for the PS5. If you're interested in learning more about them or maybe want to grab one, I do have a link down below in the description. As always, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button to let me know. Hit dislike if you didn't. It's just useful information for me to have. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and I will see you guys later.